Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
Nearly 200 countries have developed various forms of biodiversity strategies, but the United States is not one of them. Worldwide, 1 million species are threatened with extinction, according to Defenders of Wildlife, Earth Justice, the World Wildlife Fund, and several other groups. Against that threat, those organizations say the United States must adopt an effective, whole-of-government approach to prevent the loss of species, the collapse of ecosystems, and the increasing threats these losses pose to our health, security, and well-being. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at National Parks Traveler. What exactly would a national biodiversity strategy look like? What would it entail? How does it differ from efforts that have been ongoing for years? To explore those and other questions about biodiversity, we're joined today by Robert Dewey, the Vice President of Government Relations at Defenders of Wildlife, and Dr. Lindsay Rosa, who directs Defenders Center for Conservation Innovation. We'll be back in a minute with them to discuss what a national biodiversity strategy would look like.
In addition to some of the best rates in the country, Interior Federal Credit Union gives back their members more than other financial institutions in the form of dividends and low or no fees. With higher dividend rates, you can earn more in all your accounts, like certificates, money markets, or even a checking account. They focus to make sure that their members aren't being nickeled and dimed every time they make a transaction. That's the beauty of Interior Federal Credit Union. The Grand Teton National Park Foundation is a private, nonprofit organization that supports projects that protect and enhance Grand Teton National Park's cultural, historic, and natural resources. By funding initiatives that go beyond what the National Park Service could accomplish on its own, Foundation donors improve the visitor experience and provide benefits to the National Park System for decades to come. See their successes at gtnpf.org. The Everglades Foundation, the only organization whose sole mission is to restore and protect America's Everglades. Learn more at evergladesfoundation.org.
Okay, we're discussing the call for a national biodiversity strategy with Robert Dewey, Vice President of Government Relations at Defenders of Wildlife, and Dr. Lindsay Rosa, who directs Defenders Center for Conservation Innovation. Welcome to the Traveler, Robert and Lindsay.
Thank you, Kurt. Thanks so much for having us.
First off, let's talk broadly about extinction. Federal wildlife officials announced back in October that 22 animals and 1 plant should be declared officially extinct and removed from the endangered species list. Most of these species were likely extinct or nearly extinct by the time the Endangered Species Act was passed back in 1973, and therefore there was little hope that drastic conservation methods would be able to save them. That's an alarming number, and yet the worst could be yet to come. We're looking at 1 million species threatened with extinction worldwide. Why so many? What's going on here?
Yeah, Kurt, thanks. They are staggering numbers, and the numbers go on. Over 40% of insect species threatened with extinction. In North America, 3 billion birds have been lost since 1970, and there's more of that. There are, as have been described, 5 main drivers of biodiversity loss that are focused on mainly land and sea use change, overexploitation of species, pollution, invasive species, and climate change. And all of these really, on their own have a major impact on species and their survival. But together, the synergies are continuing to put on these extra pressures.
I guess we shouldn't be surprised. Just look what's happened in the national park system. We think, or at least we like to think, that national parks and their inhabitants, their wildlife, their flora and fauna are forever. But back in 1987, James Gleick wrote a piece in the New York Times under a headline that declared, "Species are vanishing from many national parks." In that article, he wrote that many species of mammals are disappearing from North America's national parks solely because the parks, even those covering hundreds of thousands of acres, are too small to support them. Parks as vast as Yosemite and Mount Rainier have lost more than 1/4 of the species originally found there, and smaller parks have lost as many as 35 to 40%. I mean, staggering numbers. I mean, we like to think about the national park system as a forever project, and yet we've lost an astounding number of native species. And we have to keep this in perspective. I mean, some parks, native species, you might have 20 different species of mammals or fewer than that. But nevertheless, the percentage losses are staggering.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our national parks are, they create this and continue to maintain this amazing habitat for our species. But some of, the changes that are occurring are turning them, those that aren't already islands, into islands, which, really degrades their potential for connecting habitats for species to continue to move. Gopher tortoise in Fort Matanzas, for example, it needs large parcels of land, undeveloped land, of course. Roadkill is one of the major causes of death for adult tortoises, and we don't expect them to stay inside the national monument. So now the species has experienced over 80% decline in populations over the last century, and the numbers are expected to continue to drop as habitat outside of the parks is degraded or fragmented. And that's just one example. Other things like pollution. I'm sure, as you know, 90% of America's national parks are plagued by significant air pollution problems. Sequoia National Park in California experiencing some of the worst of it, and disappearance of endangered species like the mountain yellow-legged frog in these parks is linked to that pollution, to deposition of pesticides from the Central Valley. And it continues. So that's why we're pushing for this national biodiversity strategy, to really create a strategy that serves all species and an approach to bringing an end to the rising extinction rates.
So Robert, I'm wondering if you can outline or define exactly what a national biodiversity strategy is and what it would look like and how it might be applied across the country.
Yes, Kurt, as you noted in your opening remarks, nearly 200 countries have some form of national biodiversity strategy. And we really think that with the overwhelming evidence of a crisis for biodiversity and nature, the U.S. adopting a national biodiversity strategy is long overdue. I think the strategy is urgently needed for a number of reasons. One, I think the mere development of a strategy by the U.S. would give greater attention and focus and make addressing the biodiversity crisis a national priority, and a national priority that it needs to be. It's taken a long time for public and policymakers to understand and respond to the climate crisis, and that is urgently needed, and there's still a lot of work to be done in that regard. But I would venture to guess that public understanding and awareness of the climate crisis is significantly greater than also a very compelling natural disaster, which is the biodiversity crisis. So making the biodiversity crisis and responding to it a national priority is one benefit of a national biodiversity strategy. But more specifically, as the name suggests, a national biodiversity strategy would identify actions and approaches the country should take to comprehensively address the leading drivers of the biodiversity crisis. And as Lindsay was outlining, really those are those 5 areas again. They are climate, they are habitat loss and degradation, they are pollution, invasive species, and overexploitation of wildlife. The nation has begun under the current administration to take meaningful action on 2 of those drivers, climate and habitat loss, through promotion of an initiative called 30 by 30. But there are really these 3 other drivers, pollution, invasive species, and overexploitation, that there are initiatives and programs scattered through the federal government, but I would say they're not well coordinated. They're certainly not well funded, and there certainly needs to be more attention to those drivers. In fact, I think there's strong evidence to indicate that those 3 drivers are actually greater contributors to the biodiversity crisis than the other 2, than to climate and to habitat loss. So they are really significant issues. And I know, in fact, for national parks, that invasive species, as I'm sure you know, Kurt, is a huge issue for national parks, for example.
Yeah, it really is. We've been running a months-long series on invasive species in the parks, ranging from vegetation to mosquitoes to invasive pythons down in Everglades National Park, and it's a serious problem, and I hate to say it, but it's growing in some areas. I'm wondering, this is a national biodiversity strategy is all about ensuring that the U.S. government is going to take an effective whole-of-government approach to preventing species extinction and ecosystem collapse. How do you go about ensuring that happens? I mean, one of the problems with this, the way our country operates, is every 4 years you could have a change in administration in Washington, or a change in the makeup in Congress, and a change in philosophy of what's important. So if the Biden administration passed a comprehensive national biodiversity strategy, how do you ensure that it remains in effect going forward, no matter what political party controls the White House or controls the Congress?
Sure. Just to kind of restate, the idea of a national biodiversity strategy is really to create a whole of government blueprint to facilitate coordination among agencies, to make them better utilize existing laws and authorities and programs that they have. Also, though, to encourage them to work more collaboratively with states, with tribes, with non-governmental organizations, and also to consider new approaches to addressing these problems. And then finally, to identify funding needs to better make the programs and laws that we now have work. For example, in the case of the Endangered Species Act, that act has been an incredible success, and yet it has been terribly underfunded. And while it's been highly effective in preventing extinction of species, it has been less effective because of funding in recovering species. And much more could be done if the act was funded. So I think our view about the future and the durability, if you will, of a national biodiversity strategy has several aspects to it. One, I think we believe that a biodiversity strategy should not just be announced by the federal government. Of course not. Was the case for the process that led to the development of the recent administration initiative, America the Beautiful. We believe that a national biodiversity strategy should be developed with an inclusive and collaborative process that engages people. It engages states, it engages citizens, engages tribes, it engages organizations in figuring out what needs to be done. Again, developing a blueprint with significant input. And we believe that this public input and collaboration and development will contribute to its durability. The other is I believe that it's just common sense. I would be surprised that if people of different political persuasions are pro extinction. I think everybody wants to save the basis of life on Earth, and many of us believe in the intrinsic value of species and the beauty of nature, in addition to the practical benefits for people in terms of medicines and in terms of the economy. So I think the practical benefits will help contribute to the durability of a national biodiversity strategy. And regardless, it will always serve as a blueprint and recommendations for what needs to be done. We can have debates over the degree to which these programs should be funded. We believe they need to be robustly funded, but we need to know what needs to be done to save biodiversity.
Yeah, and certainly, as you mentioned, you need buy-in from top to bottom, and not just in Washington, but across the states. And I think we're seeing some of that come to fruition. Here in Utah, public pressure, I think, led the state to build a wildlife overpass over Interstate 80, just about 5 miles from where I'm sitting. And that has seen an incredible amount of wildlife cross that bridge. And in fact, it went viral when the state put the video up. People were just amazed at the mountain lions and the bobcats and the moose that were using that. And of course, more recently, we've seen the movement in California to build a wildlife overpass to enable mountain lions to move back and forth through different ecosystems and not get run over.
Well, I would just add to that, since you mentioned connectivity and helping wildlife navigate highways and roads, that, in terms of bipartisan support, we were pleased that the recently enacted infrastructure law does promote wildlife crossings and has a good amount of funding for that very purpose. So, just to the point of consensus and support for some actions that are critical to conserving wildlife populations and actions that help address the biodiversity crisis. I think there is some encouraging evidence of that. Thanks, Kurt, for pointing out in your home state there. But I would just also supplement it by pointing out the infrastructure bill at the national level.
We're talking today with Robert Dewey, the Vice President of Government Relations at Defenders of Wildlife, and Dr. Lindsay Rosa, who directs Defenders Center for Conservation Innovation. The topic is a national biodiversity strategy. We'll be right back in a minute.
Washington State is graced with 3 spectacular national parks, each different and special in their own unique ways. As the official nonprofit partner and the only philanthropic organization dedicated exclusively to supporting these parks through charitable contributions, Washington's National Park Fund has a mission to raise private support to deepen everyone's love for, understanding of, and experiences in Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. Share your passion for these parks at WNPF.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Nova Scotia. 8,000 miles of coastline dotted with colorful fishing villages, quaint coastal towns, and an abundance of scenic natural beauty. Home to 2 national parks, Cape Breton Highlands and Kejimkujik. Spend your nights under a canopy of twinkling stars. Spend your days exploring trails, beaches, historical waterways, and tons of cultural and recreational experiences. Visit novascotia.com today and start planning your natural getaway. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It is also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That is why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people, inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org.
So when we talk about a national biodiversity strategy, obviously that implies that there are some holes in the current approach that we're taking across the country to ensure biodiversity thrives across the landscape. Can you point to some of the biggest inconsistencies and gaps that we have with our current U.S. conservation policies?
Sure. First, I think it's important to point out that the U.S. does have a collection of laws, policy, and programs that are, for many countries, they're envy. We have an Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, and the long list goes on. And then, of course, national parks and many types of protected areas. So we have a good basis to work from, and particularly with respect to the Endangered Species Act. However, we believe that more could be done with these laws to fully implement them. And I think what we really hope in terms of a national biodiversity strategy is that the focus is on the leading drivers of the biodiversity crisis. So when you look at laws, policies, and programs that the federal government has and states, tribes, and other conservation partners have that are directed at conserving wildlife, I think you really want to look at it through the lens of these leading drivers of the biodiversity crisis and making sure that agencies have the direction to prioritize the utilization of these laws for wildlife and to address these leading drivers, that they talk amongst each other more effectively than they have in the past, perhaps, for example, and that they consider new approaches because as good as the laws and programs and policies the nation has, Certainly it's not perfect, and there certainly are areas for improvement or fuller implementation. And then last, of course, is funding. The point I made earlier is that the Endangered Species Act is a highly effective law, but it's fiscally starved. We could do so much more as a nation to recover species that are listed under the Endangered Species Act with a relatively modest amount of additional funding.
Dr. Rosa, we have hundreds of millions of acres across the public landscape in national parks, national forests, the BLM, Bureau of Land Management. And of course, there are many, many more acres in state public lands, state-owned lands. Does the National Park Service, because everybody seems to look up to it in this country, have a key role in advancing a national biodiversity strategy? I mean, people love the national park system. They love national parks. Can the Park Service serve a central role to ensuring a national biodiversity strategy moves forward?
I think that there's certainly opportunity, for the national parks to, serve as a key example for moving forward. And obviously, the National Park Service is an important agency in making sure that this collaborative, integrative effort among the agencies moves forward. So obviously, national parks, national wildlife refuges are some of the key lands, public lands that we point to when we talk about protecting wildlife and the habitats. And really, I think that these can continue to be shining examples of ways to do that, and communicating with these agencies and those that are managing lands for things other than conservation. And those missions are part of, making sure that the national strategy comes together in the most effective manner. There are pilot projects out there to collaboratively protect and recover endangered species, such as Least Bell's vireo in the Southwest. And this particular project includes right now Army Corps of Engineers, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Reclamation, Military Services, Forest Service, and others that were really working together to kind of maximize their efforts and develop a wide range recovery framework. Something like this serves to benefit, obviously, other species as well, and I think can support each agency's capacity to meet its mission. And the National Park Service and lands are an important part of this. So excited to kind of see fruits of these kinds of efforts, but we need more of this going forward. And I think national parks are an important part of that.
And Kurt, if I might just add to that in addition, I think many of the listeners are probably familiar with the incredible success story that was the restoration of wolves to Yellowstone National Park. That has had benefits for the ecosystem of the park. It's had economic benefits to the local communities, and national parks, in the case of Yellowstone, has been an incredible success story. We see that, of course, with other jewels of the national park system. I know how well familiar you are with the Everglades, the vast array of species down there, and efforts to do more to restore the functioning of that ecosystem. So I guess my contribution to your question would be is that that national parks have a huge role and have incredible habitat and wildlife values, and certainly can play a key role in a national biodiversity strategy.
I'm wondering, I've been doing this for quite a while, covering environmental issues and covering national parks. And back in the last century, there were some calls that we shouldn't put national parks under bell jars and keep it as it was in the 18th century or even the 19th century. And so I'm wondering, earlier when I mentioned that some national parks had lost a quarter of their native animals, their faunal species, there's probably going to be some pushback against seeing grizzly bears return to Yosemite National Park or Sequoia National Park. And then when you look at climate change and the invasion of invasive species in Everglades, which the Burmese python has basically wiped out small mammals, the raccoons, the opossums, even some deer and bird species. They go after their eggs. I could go on, I guess, and I wonder what constitutes success of a national biodiversity strategy. Do we want to see all the native species return to their historic landscapes, or how do you balance that?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think that, the vision here is, small steps. First, we need to actually curb some of these extinction rates. We need to be able to support and ensure better protections and conservation of those species that are listed. I think from there, that's a pretty great starting point. Obviously, we would love to see more done, but I think that these are some of the key pieces that the National Biodiversity Strategy is trying to addressing directly, obviously the crisis at hand, and being able to make the progress to ensure that, our nation can continue to protect its natural legacy and remain a global leader in nature conservation.
The Biden administration clearly is on board with conservation and climate issues. Case in point, Robert, you mentioned the 30 by 30 plan, national goal to conserve 30% of the Earth's land and sea areas by 2030, at least here in the United States. Does the National Biodiversity Strategy tie into that plan and the steps needed to see biodiversity strategy succeed?
Yes, most definitely it does. I think that the so-called 30 by 30 initiative, which for the Biden administration is embodied in an initiative they call America the Beautiful, is a central part of a biodiversity strategy. It is really addressing two of the drivers, particularly the driver of habitat degradation and development. And so it focuses on the habitat driver of the biodiversity crisis. It also focuses on the climate and land use aspects as well as another driver. So it can be a really important building block. And I think the relationship goes on because for the Biden administration and for all of us, equitable access to nature is an important concept, and making sure populations that maybe have had less access to nature have that opportunity. At the same time, I think with a national biodiversity strategy, that is, of course, by definition, focused on wildlife and making sure that we address, kind of the root causes of the biodiversity crisis. And so when you look at it through that lens, you want to make sure that the 30 by 30 initiative really lives up to its original vision, which was to have sufficient protected habitat to help address the biodiversity crisis. And there are a lot of very important goals that the administration has identified for 30 by 30. We want to make sure that protected areas really do serve the purpose of conserving biodiversity. There are other purposes that should be served, but we want to make sure that doesn't get lost or excessively diluted as the nation pursues this critical goal of protecting additional areas for biodiversity. And then I guess just the last comment I made, harkening back to an earlier point, is that as important as 30 by 30 is to the National Biodiversity Strategy, it addresses two important but drivers of the biodiversity crisis, but leaves out three other drivers that collectively are huge contributors to the biodiversity crisis overall. Obviously, there is this effort in the House of Representatives led by Representative Joe Neguse from Colorado to encourage the administration to develop a national biodiversity strategy. Representative Neguse has introduced a resolution, and he's also led an effort by House members to talk to the administration about the need for a national biodiversity strategy. In fact, some 50 members of the House have joined him in a communication to the president on this subject. at the state level, there are probably 4 or 5 resolutions calling on President Biden to develop a national biodiversity strategy. Those have been introduced or will soon be introduced or are advancing in New Mexico, Colorado, Washington State. We believe there will be one in Hawaii, and those are some of the leading states. So there is a lot going on amongst elected officials to promote this issue to the president.
Dr. Rosa, what about the creeping rise of extinction denial? I've heard that there's been a concerted effort to deny that there has been an increase in species extinctions. This effort has spread from fringe blogs to influential media outlets on the right-wing side of politics, and it's even been brought up in a congressional hearing. Is that still an issue out there, or is there a general acceptance that species extinction is a serious problem we need to face?
Certainly on the scientist side of things, there's kind of nothing to dispute here. I think the biodiversity crisis is very much something that is recognized, and I think that as Robert has been saying pretty clearly, it's not a partisan issue. I think that this is something that we're all very deeply connected to, and that's something that's kind of undeniable, is that we rely on our nature and our species, and it's obvious that they're relying on us to do something, and so that's the reason why we need to act on a national biodiversity strategy.
We're talking today about species extinction and the need for a national biodiversity strategy. We're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
Wild Tribute is lifestyle apparel founded for our parks and public lands. We donate 4% of our proceeds to support America's most wild and historic places. This is our Wild Tribute. Together, we can and will make a difference for the parks. You can learn more at wildtribute.com. Whether it be strategy, business planning, change management, board development, executive search, or diversity planning, Potrero Group is here to help. They mix a depth of experience in the parks and land space with the breadth of best practices from other industries. For more information or to schedule a preliminary conversation, go to potrerogroup.com, P-O-T-R-E-R-O, group.com. The Yosemite Conservancy helps visitors connect with Yosemite through adventures, volunteering, and the arts. It's the only nonprofit dedicated to supporting Yosemite National Park and funds grants to improve trails, restore habitat, protect wildlife, and inspire the next generation of nature lovers. Learn more at yosemite.org.
Okay, we're back today talking with Robert Dewey, the Vice President of Government Relations at Defenders of Wildlife, and Dr. Lindsay Rosa, who directs Defenders Center for Conservation Innovation. Over the past 5 years, the Environmental Protection Agency has been vilified in some political circles. During the Trump administration, we saw rollbacks of clean air and carbon emission regulations. They were commonplace. On top of that, 2 EPA directors had interests inconsistent with what's best for the environment. I think we could all agree. One was an attorney representing the fossil fuel and chemical industries. Another was a former attorney general from Oklahoma who consistently sued the EPA on behalf of his oil and gas clients. Those appointments and their subsequent policies forced many EPA scientists and other staff to resign on principle. So the question is, how important is the Environmental Protection Agency to this national biodiversity strategy, and will the effort help restore the clout and reputation of the EPA?
Well, I would say that EPA is critically important to a national biodiversity strategy. Of course, conserving and maintaining water quality, air quality, to some extent, we've already talked about that a little bit, is critical to conserving natural process, maintaining natural processes, and basically the ecosystem functioning. So EPA is a critical player. You're absolutely right that under the previous administration, that agency was undercut, laws were undermined, progress was not made. And I might venture to say that that is the same situation that occurred in the Department of the Interior, and particularly for programs that are administered by the Fish and Wildlife Service. We saw the weakening of the administratively of the Endangered Species Act, weakening of the Migratory Bird Protection Act, efforts to step up drilling in sensitive habitats such as the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and the list goes on. I think what we see here is that in 2019, this international report that was really a landmark study identifying the crisis of biodiversity loss was issued. It has a very long title, The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. That certainly is a mouthful. Those of us know and love it as the IPPES report, IPPES assessment, more accurately. And it was issued at a time when we were headed in the wrong direction as a nation. As we were saying, as you pointed out, with the EPA and certainly with the Interior Department and the Fish and Wildlife Service, we were weakening protections that are critical to maintaining biodiversity, wildlife, and nature. And now we see a real opportunity with the current administration that we believe is committed to science, is committed to climate change, and is committed to making progress on these issues. So, I think that we see an opportunity to advance a national biodiversity strategy under the current political climate.
So I'm curious, where do we go from here? I know some members of Congress earlier this year called on the Biden administration to establish a national biodiversity strategy. Where does that effort stand, and is the administration listening?
We're excited by the momentum of the campaign to establish a national biodiversity strategy. At the end of the day, this can be done, the establishment of development of a national biodiversity strategy by President Biden with a stroke of the pen to announce plans to develop a national biodiversity strategy. What it really just takes is leadership to initiate this national biodiversity strategy. And we've seen good leadership from this administration on a variety of environmental fronts. We've talked about climate. We've talked about 30 by 30 and other initiatives. So, good progress has been made, but we have not yet achieved a national biodiversity strategy being announced and undertaken. But we believe our campaign is making good progress. As you pointed out recently, 50 members of Congress have called on the administration to develop a national biodiversity strategy. There is a resolution, House Resolution 69, pending in the House of Representatives, calling for the establishment of a national biodiversity strategy. And at the state level, state legislators are hearing and appreciating the need for a national biodiversity strategy and taking action. There are state resolutions calling on the administration to develop a national biodiversity strategy. I believe there's at least 4 or 5 of them that I know of that are either have been introduced, will be shortly introduced, or actually have advanced. It's not only defenders of wildlife in terms of groups calling for a national biodiversity strategy. There are some 120 groups or more that are calling for this. I think Lindsay pointed out earlier, leading scientists are on record as calling for a national biodiversity strategy. And there's even a student letter, a national student letter that I'm aware of, calling on President Biden to establish a national biodiversity strategy. So there hasn't been one announced yet, but we feel like there is growing awareness of the problem of the biodiversity crisis and the need to address it through a national biodiversity strategy. So I think we're hopeful. And in fact, there is an early opportunity for the administration to do so that we're really hoping they will capitalize on, which is the upcoming meeting of the parties to the Convention on Biodiversity. This is the Convention on Biodiversity is a international agreement that nearly 200 countries around the world have signed on to. Sadly, the U.S. is not a party to this agreement. We think that it should be, but the plain fact that it is not. However, that doesn't mean that the U.S. can't demonstrate leadership as it has historically on efforts to conserve biodiversity. And there is no better way to reestablish to the world U.S. leadership on biodiversity conservation than to announce that we are going to get our house in order and lead by developing a national biodiversity strategy. And with that international meeting occurring this summer, we think that this would be a wonderful time for President Biden to announce plans for the U.S. to develop a national biodiversity strategy.
You know, I'm curious, as that New York Times article pointed out back in 1987, even some of our biggest parks aren't big enough to ensure biodiversity. I mean, we've heard back in the 90s, if not the 80s, about the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative to enable wildlife, grizzly bears and wolves and elk and caribou to move up and down so we don't have biological islands. I think, is there a concern that, when we talk about a national biodiversity policy, a national biodiversity strategy, that there isn't enough lands, enough public lands in the federal kingdom, so to speak, the national parks and the national forests. And so we need to expand across state lands, perhaps, to ensure that there are those corridors out there. And is the general public going to embrace that? Or are they going to be concerned about you're going to take my lands through eminent domain for this strategy, or we're going to see grizzly bears and wolves on our landscape again, and we don't want to see that?
Sure, I think that is some of the concern and conversation that we've seen a little bit with the current administration's directive on 30 by 30. In terms of public lands, already, almost a third of the U.S. is in public land. Obviously, not all of it being managed in ways that are consistent or align with conservation and some of these issues that you bring up, like the need for corridors and movement. And really, again, a lot of that land is focused on the West. So we're not maximizing really biodiversity conservation, given that a lot of species only occur in, Midwest and Eastern portions of the US. So I think that, that's part of the reason why this approach, this national strategy, really needs to be whole of government, not just the federal agencies, but tribes, states. Everyone really needs to come together to make this happen, to make this an effective strategy, and also to really address effectively the biodiversity crisis, not only for now, but given climate change, we're going to need some areas that are considered climate refugia or corridors that allow for that movement to happen, given that is what we are facing.
I think there's a good example up in Montana that you're probably both aware of, the American Prairie Reserve, and the efforts that are underway there to restore a key ecosystem that once existed across much of the northern tier and the Midwest, and they're bringing back bison and all the species that relied on bison, so to speak, in terms of the prairie dogs and a lot of the bird life that benefited from the landscape as bison landscaped that landscape, if you will. Is that a good example that could be replicated elsewhere on public lands, do you think? Or on private lands even?
I think so. I think we need that collaborative effort. And yes, we focus sometimes on these bigger species, but in a lot of times that it also ends up benefiting others. We really have so much to conserve for the sake of our national and global communities. I think, that is one good example. The U.S. has species that are found nowhere else. The Gunnison sage grouse on Curacante, red cockaded woodpecker and big cypress, and, kind of a stone's throw from me, even the tiny haze spring amphipod endangered in Rock Creek Park. Can't help but give a shout out to the little guys too. And so these are, some of those examples. And again, more of the reason why we need to have collaborative long-term efforts through this national biodiversity strategy.
I'm curious, you mentioned all the organizations that are behind this push. Is there going to be a national public awareness campaign, so to speak, about the importance of species and the threat of species extinction and what this national biodiversity strategy can do?
Yes, that is the intent. We are working to highlight the problem. I mentioned this international report with a very long title that we refer to as the IPBES report. It was issued 3 years ago, and it was fortunately at the wrong time politically to actually be able to make gains. But we are, as an organization and with many of the partner organizations, very intent on working to elevate the biodiversity crisis and increase awareness about the risk to 1 million species, the importance of preventing ecosystem collapse for the benefit of human health and for the benefit of our economy. I think the situation with COVID and the pandemics just underscores why we need to address threats from habitat loss that brings animals into closer contact with people worldwide, particularly the international wildlife, live animal markets. These problems are all related to the biodiversity crisis and really are important for us to address for our own health and well-being, apart from the intrinsic benefits of nature to people. So, we really see this is a great opportunity, and we are planning to highlight these problems. Some of that information is on a collaborative website that environmental groups promoting a national biodiversity strategy have developed. That site is called 1millionspecies.org and has lots of good information on it. It's not branded by any particular organization. It is really intended to provide educational resources about national biodiversity strategy and the problem facing the biodiversity crisis facing wildlife here in the U.S. and worldwide.
Well, Robert and Lindsay, I appreciate your time today. It's a fascinating issue that the National Parks Traveler has long followed in recent years, and certainly anxious to see how it moves forward through the administration and out there on the rest of the United States. Thanks for your time today.
Kurt, thanks so much for having us on today. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thanks, Kurt.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. Combating species extinctions and enhancing biodiversity requires much on-the-ground work to restore ecosystems. Next week, we'll be talking to Dr. Jerry Lorenz, who heads Audubon's Everglades Science Center, about the final steps being taken to mitigate the negative effects canals that were cut across the Cape Sable area of Everglades National Park back in the 1930s have had on the landscape there. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling national park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit nationalparkstraveler.org.